Starting in 3, 2, 1. Welcome everybody to Cosmic Divide episode 2. We are live from the Acend studio, sponsored by Nifter. Thank you so much for building us this wonderful studio where we can have our intellectual sparring debates about the Valorant scene. And we've got a big, juicy episode for us today. There's been a lot of stuff that's happened since our first episode. And if I'm not mistaken, both of us were pretty wrong about our champions predictions in that one. So, we're going to try and redeem ourselves here in episode number 2 with some takes about both pre-franchising and post-franchising. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, is just kind of like lots of stuff about, who is the best team before franchising happened, because we have this nice little cutoff point, don't we, TMV, where we can kind of like separate, Valorant 1.0 from Valorant 2.0. So how are you feeling today, and are you ready to talk about it?
I'm feeling pretty good. Yes, our initial takes, well, it was an NA versus EMEA debate about who would do better at champs, and then of course a Brazilian team went and won. So that's kind of how it went in the first stage of it. But yeah, I feel pretty good. I think some of these topics we're going to talk about are pretty interesting. There's some interesting debates to be had here for sure. Some interesting questions to bring up. And so I'm sure it'll make for thrilling viewing the rest of the way.
Perfect. Well, let's just go ahead and hop into it. As everybody knows, we've got the roster. Well, the first roster lock is kind of a soft roster lock for the franchise teams, the partnered teams. I guess I should probably use the word partnered because it's not a franchise league technically. So the first sort of soft roster lock, where teams have to turn in their intention for a roster and sort of the work status of the players that are going to be working with them in 2023, coming up in just about a week. October 15th is the date for that. So we're going to get a good look at what the teams have fielded, the wheeling and dealing that has been rumored and reported and leaked on Twitter. It's been very interesting to be on Twitter in the last week or so. And that means that we get to talk about those teams. Maybe in our next episode, we'll do a rundown of that. But let's go ahead and talk about our first topic of before the roster lock, before all of this madness has happened. Talk about pre-franchise. And we're going to start by talking about who is the best team of pre-franchising. I think there's maybe like 2 or 3 main options that people have thought about. But why don't you give me your take on who you think the best team is, and then we can maybe agree, maybe disagree.
Okay, so yeah, to me, obviously, there's going to be one obvious option that I think people bring up, which is of course Optic, MV Optic, because of course they went to 3 finals, they won 1 tournament. Of course, no team did actually repeat and win 2 tournaments, and there's kind of a few different ways you can break down this question. To me, if this is just about like who's the most consistent team in terms of being at the top, obviously then you'd probably say it has to be Optic. You could interpret this question as who had the highest peak overall in terms of pre-franchising, and to me that is a much more difficult question overall. You could definitely look at teams like Gambit. I'm sure some people might argue that FPX, maybe even stage 1 FPX, you could argue were better than stage 2 that won Copenhagen. You could look at teams obviously like Sentinels as well, right? You could definitely make an argument if you're talking about peaks, like Sentinels maybe being the best team, because I think that they didn't lose a map in the first international tournament, I think, and obviously dominated in NA before that as well. So like there are also different ways that you can kind of approach this question, and I think if you are talking about who had the highest peak at any one time, I might be slightly inclined to say Gambit. I just think the Gambit, like Masters Berlin, the international tournament there, and then going into champs as well. Some of the games that they had, like destroying G2 13-0 on Icebox, things like that. Like we didn't see many other teams do that, right? I know obviously they didn't go on to win champs, but obviously making the final. Like some of the maps that were just utter destructions, and when particularly like Nats and Chronicle were at the like height of their powers. Oh my god, was it so hard to stop. But if you are just looking at like consistency, then obviously you probably would be going for Optic, but I think you can make an argument if you want that, maybe Optic's peak wasn't the highest peak that any team has had.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that point, where, it does make sense to say Optic just because you think about, especially in 2022, it's like they were always at the top of North America. I mean, maybe they weren't the first seed out of North America, but they were still the best team in North America, in my opinion, during that whole time. And so the results were very consistent in this last year. But if we're talking about all of pre-franchising, I don't know if I would necessarily consider them that, because they were pretty solidly, I think, the third best team in North America during like 2020 as Envy. You know, they were behind 100 Thieves, I would say, and they were definitely behind Sentinels for sure. And if we're going back all the way, I think I might have to agree that Gambit is probably the best team of pre-franchising, because they won Masters 1, like the original Masters 1. They were the best team in CIS. Not that the region had the greatest competition, but they were the #1 team there. And then they kind of continued to be like the best team in Europe. Sorry, Acend. Throughout the rest of essentially the time of pre-franchising. You know, again, they didn't even make it to champions in this last iteration, but I think their peak probably at Masters 3 was probably the best Valorant that I've seen played, period, in the entire history of the game so far. And so I think I would probably go with them as my like peaky peak team. But then we also could have the discussion of like what this consistency. I mean, we're talking about Optic for 2022, but what about like Vision Strikers DRX? Remember, they won 105 games in a row.
It's true.
And they went to like
true.
all of these, you know, okay, they didn't make it because of New Turn for the one international LAN, the very first one, but then they were there for the rest of them, and they were very consistently in the top 6. And so I would even potentially throw them in the mix as a potential team that has to be up there as potentially the best and most consistent franchising team for like the entire, or sorry, pre-franchise era team, as one that's up there as well. So
that might be one of the biggest what ifs, by the way, because New Turn came third, but you cannot convince me that New Turn were better than Vision Strikers back then. And if New Turn could come third,
yeah,
I legit think that Vision Strikers might have won that tournament, or at least been in the final with Sentinels. Like, I think that could have been like a massive turning point where it was like, oh my god, Korea's already dominant in this esport, like straight away. But obviously with New Turn winning, it was kind of a big flip of a coin, I'll say, in terms of the direction, and then obviously DRX kind of with a constant letdown team until champs. So
right.
yeah, I didn't even think about them, but yeah, that's a good option as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a hard discussion to have, just because there's like really no parity between these events and like the different patches that we're on and that kind of stuff. So it's a little hard to say, but I think you and I would both agree that the best performance, I think, overall was probably Gambit at any particular tournament. Okay, well, let's take a little bit of a toxic route now. We're gonna say, who is the most disappointing team of the pre-franchise era? You know, it's a little sad to say that some teams didn't really live up to the expectations that, you know, we analysts had, the fans had. So I'm really curious to hear who you think was the team that maybe had like the highest expectation and sort of the least results for that.
For me, there's kind of two options here. One is Fnatic, and the other is 100 Thieves. If we go and start with Fnatic, I think particularly after they finished second in the first international tournament, I think everyone was like, okay, Fnatic are obviously one of the top teams in the world. They're going to be competing, you know, at every LAN. They're going to be competing. They're going to, you know, eventually win these tournaments. And they were, you know, at every LAN but one. And they always got, you know, close outside of Reykjavik, where obviously that was kind of not their fault. But, you know, they always got fairly close. They always did pretty well, you know, top 4s and whatnot. But they never actually did it. And they kept changing their team slightly as well. You know, it was like, okay, if we take these out and put these guys in, then, you know, we'll definitely be good. And if we, now we'll take these guys out and put these guys in instead. And now this is definitely a better team. And this time we'll be able to do it. And it felt like each time, you know, they kept slightly improving. And their qualifiers just kept going better and better. And I don't think they lost a game in the EMEA qualifiers in the group stages to qualify for the 2 international LANs. But they just never did it. They just never actually managed to win. And I think they will see that as a big disappointment, especially after, if you would have asked them, like, after the first international tournament, I'm sure that Boaster and Mini, whoever else, would have said, oh, yeah, we're going to have won one, by, like, this point in time. But they never did, and in fact, they got kind of further away, you could say, than that moment. I definitely think that they would have thought they'd at least get to more finals. And they haven't. And then for 100 Thieves, who I think are another option as well, is obviously they were coming in, they were kind of this team in North America, obviously a lot of clout, right? They had Hiko and they had all these names, and it was like, okay, this is a team that can compete. And again, they had a kind of, rise towards kind of, the midpoint of 2021. It looked like they were on the rise. It looked like they were one of the better teams in the world. And then it kind of all just fell apart. And I think, most people might not really think about them right now because it feels like they're on the up, right? It feels like they're building, but like in terms of like where they were like mid 2021, and then they had the biggest drop, I think, of any team maybe ever, like in terms of just sudden decline of like, oh yeah, we were meant to be one of the best teams, but now we're just awful and completely rebuilding, and we're hoping to just build it back up slowly. Which isn't necessarily a bad idea, but I feel like some of that expectation got pushed away of like, oh, this is going to take time, guys. We need this time to rebuild. But for an org like 100 Thieves, and especially for where they were, I think it is a disappointment, that they couldn't take where they were in kind of mid 2021 and take that and be like, okay, we're going to be the best team in the world. I think that is a disappointment overall.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting take. I hadn't really thought about 100 Thieves, but now that you mention it, yeah, they did win First Strike, and it was like, oh yeah, you got this massive like CS experience with Nitro, and you got Steel and Hiko and Ethan. Like this is the North American super team that was promised, but then the results were not quite there. So I do like that take, actually. I completely agree with you on Fnatic. This is kind of the team that I thought of when I was first thinking of this topic. It's like, Fnatic, the branding, they are EU basically. Yeah. They've got the biggest brains, they've got the crazy talent, they got the best scouting. Where's the results? So there is that factor. I'm going to offer you a couple other options though. I think there is sort of an interesting play of like, the expectation from fans versus the results. And if you're going to go with that, I would have to throw like, orgs such as G2, which is massive hype, and zero results. I would have to throw Sentinels in there because of their initial rise to fame and then fall off, although it was a bit more gradual perhaps. But then I would also have to throw Team Liquid in there. This is a team with Scream, right? You've got Scream, you've got Navera, you've got Yampy, sort of like this wonder child from CS as well. You've got Sliggy, like the most clouded coach, the coach of the people. Where's the results? There's no results for Team Liquid. And this is an org with just massive backing. They have one of the best names, the best brands in esports. And I think they probably accomplished the least out of all of the clouded teams if we're taking that metric into account. So honestly, for me, I think it's probably Team Liquid because they really just, they had their moments, but I don't really think they ever had sort of that real run where I was like, Team Liquid could do it. I don't think I ever felt at any point at any tournament that they were a favorite to like win the tournament. And to me, that is sort of an unacceptable result for a team as big as Team Liquid.
Yeah, they were kind of always in the shadow of Fnatic somewhat in terms of like, if they both qualify for a tournament, you thought like, Fnatic are more the favorite team than Liquid in this tournament. And they went to a lot of tournaments together as well. And it always did feel like Fnatic would always go like one step further. I think the only time that's not true is Champs 2021.
Right.
But even then, they finished as the third team from their own region. Like, I know obviously Acend and Gambit, were the finalists, but still, you're still the third best team from your region there. That's not really a shining example of success, really, when, two teams from your own region are beating you.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, let us know. I feel like that's a really interesting question. So if you have a take of your own, let us know in the comments, because I feel like there was a lot of disappointed fans in the last couple of years. Okay, let's go back on the positive note here. We're going to talk about players, because if there's one thing that I've learned about Valorant, it's that, the orgs matter, but the players matter more. So, Hens, Shroud. They have Shroud. You know, this was like the biggest news moment of the last 6 months. So, who is the best player of pre-franchising in your opinion?
So again, I think there's really only two options here in my mind. Maybe if I think a bit more, there'll be more coming in. But I think Ye has to be it. I mean, that stat. When was it? It was like stage 2 qualifiers against like EG, like midway through or like early in the playoffs of like qualifying for Copenhagen was the first time he went negative in a series for Optic or Envy. Like, you know, 10 months or whatever after he joined. That is unfathomable how insane that is. Like, to do that as a player. And I know he's playing Jet and he's playing Chamber and whatever, but like, everyone else is going negative like every other game. Like, that is just so absurd. But again, if we're talking about, like, overall consistency, it would be Ye, and I wouldn't even have to hesitate to think it's definitely Ye. If we're talking about, again, like, all-time just peaks of a player for like a tournament or for like a time period, again Nats comes into my mind. I remember one of the because I got into Valorant fairly late. Actually, I got into Valorant just before the first international tournament. Was when I started playing the game and I started getting into the esport. And so, I wasn't too familiar with, all the teams and who everyone was, right? And so I remember watching the qualifiers for the Masters Berlin, and Team Liquid were playing against Gambit. And obviously I knew Team Liquid from the first, Reykjavik tournament. So I was like, oh, Team Liquid are a good team. They're probably going to stomp this, no-name team. They're playing against Gambit, of course. And Nats won every fight. Every single fight, Nats won it. I think he went like, in fact, I got it up here. I went and found the game. He went 22-7 against them on Bind, and I just remember like feeling like that is one of the most incredible performances I'd ever seen at that time. Like, he just absolutely destroyed them. And Nats at his peak was just different. It was just every decision he makes when he's playing at his best, it just feels like he knows where the enemies are. It feels like every time he peeks, they're looking the wrong way, right? Every time he goes on one of his lurks, he's always found the right timing. It's just absurd how good he was during that time. It didn't make any sense how one player could consistently be that good. And so, again, if you're arguing about who's had the highest peak, because of course Ye as well has had some incredible peaks and has, some incredible tournaments and whatever, and some of the best tournaments we've seen. But there is an argument there, I think, that, the very best like a player has ever played. I could see an argument for Nats, but overall, if you put a gun to my head, I would just say Ye is the best player of pre-franchising. Just for the consistency alone, I think that is just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue. I'm looking at his champion stats and the fact that he was the highest first kills, 96 first kills, 6 higher than Buzz, who was second, 20 higher over his teammate Victor, who was number 3rd, and he had 40 first deaths. So a more than 2-to-1 ratio of first duels won by Ye. Unbelievable performance. But for me, this might be a little controversial. I don't think it's even close. I think it's Nats. I think Nats is the best player pre-franchising, and I don't think it's particularly close because of a couple factors. Number one, I think the Chamber Jet factor is something you have to include in this conversation. I've been very vocal about this since the beginning of the game. I think that if you're playing Chamber, if you're playing Jet before the nerfs, I think you're literally playing an easier version of the game. And I don't know if it's really something you can argue. Like, these two characters, when they had the free escape on Jet, it was just not a fair game. Like, the duels, it was impossible to trade, still impossible to trade Chamber. The economic advantage that these two characters give you allows you to get more rifles, get more ops. It just fundamentally changes the game so that you play easier Valorant than everybody else that's playing the game. And so with that being said, I'm not discounting the performance of somebody like Ye or any of these other great sort of like, star duelist, oppers, whatever. But I do think you have to just discount a little bit the amount of impact that they would have if there was no agent like this. I've seen Ye play Brimstone. I've seen him play Fade and Ranked and stuff like that. He still absolutely pounds. He just dumpsters everybody that he's playing against. He would still have incredible stats, but I don't think it would be quite the same impact if these agents with the free escape didn't exist. And the reason I think that Nats is the best player of pre-franchising is because he literally defined how you play the role. Like, everybody, do you remember the Nats setup on Bind? That setup is still used by every single Viper that plays Bind to this day. Every single Viper uses the Nats setup. Every single Viper uses the Nats setup on B site. Every single Viper player plays Viper how Nats plays Viper. And I think that the fact that he was hard carrying his team, and his team had a lot of very, very talented players, but he hard carried his team in multiple games at multiple tournaments on a role that is notorious for being sort of, you know, the AFK role. You're sitting in camera half the time when you're playing Cypher. You're not shooting people, and you're still top fragging and carrying the game in that role. I think that's just something that, for me, again, when you sort of like calculate in the agent factor, there's just no real argument in my mind that Nats was the best player.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay. Well, I was expecting you to push back a little bit more, but
no,
yes.
no, I love Nets. I love Nets. I mean, yeah, I love everything about Nets. So I'm very happy to have Nets as the best player as well. No argument.
All right. Well, this brings us to kind of a very interesting. This one might go a little bit longer than these previous discussions. We might have a few more arguments here because we just talked about the agent factor a little bit, and let's get into agents a little bit. We're going to talk about the most important agent pre-franchising, pre-partnership for the game of Valorant. What agent changed the game the most, had the most impact on the game, defined the meta the most? I think there's quite a few different choices here, so I'm really curious to hear what you have to say.
To me, there is only one option. I don't even think this is close, to be honest. I think this is just, it's Jett. It's Jett, and it's not close. For as much as like Jett has obviously disappeared ever since the dash nerf and whatever, and people now will be talking about Chamber, and you know, I'm sure some of you, when that question came up, will be like, oh, Chamber, right? Chamber has dominated essentially from what, like stage 2 of this year onwards, so like 2 international tournaments. Jett dominated the tournament before that, and the tournament before that. You might not remember that Jett dominated Masters Reykjavik, but she did. And the tournament before that, and the tournament before that, and the tournament before that. Oh, and the tournament before that. Like Jett, and then even there was a stat. I don't know about champs, but before champs, someone came up with a stat of like, I think the top 20 ACS performances in a tournament. 2 of them were Chambers. The other 18 were Jett, because Jett gave you that option of, obviously, if you're Chamber, you have to somewhat stay within your setup, right? You're going to stay on the side of the map where your setup is until, you really have to rotate. Whereas for Jett, it was like, I'm on my way, right? Oh, there's someone there, I'm on my way, right? And like, we saw people like CNED and TENS and whatever, just like roam around the map, go wherever they wanted to. They could push up, they could stay deep. You didn't know what they were going to do, and they would just dominate the game. And to me, Jett was just the overwhelming factor on every single map for a time, right? Obviously, we did see changes kind of towards the end of Jett's life, where, on maps like Bind, we saw more Rays and whatever. But for the most part, there was still a lot of teams who were like, I'm a Jett player, we're playing Jett on every single map because why not, right? Because we can. And I just think that Jett, I mean, it's absurd to think, like, back in the day, like, going back to, like, the first international tournament, Jett had, like, 3 smokes that lasted an age. Her knives were only a 6-cost ult. She had a 6-cost knives ult on an agent that gets, like, 3 kills a round often. Like, you had your ult every other round, some of these games. And you could recharge them with the right click. Talk about never running out of a gun. Economy-wise, it was absurd, right? Like, just absurd. And you right-click them, and it would kill them, and you get the knives back, and you had a shotgun and a rifle in your hands all the time, and then you add the op onto that as well. And you could dash in, and that's the thing, right? Like, Chamber, obviously, is a very strong defensive agent, but, like, Jett was, like, both. Jett was, like, the best attacking and the best defensive agent all the time. It was just so absurd, that agent going back in time. And I know there was some, like pre-nerf Astra was insane, pre-nerf Viper was insane, even Sova, you might say, as well. But to me, it just, everything was built around Jett. And I think that Jett was just way too strong. And obviously the devs kind of just delayed and delayed and delayed, nerfing the jet dash as long as they could, and they've kind of done the same with Chamber now as well, right? Where
Yep.
they're just like desperate to nerf everything else but the one thing that they really need to change.
Yep.
And so yeah, we're seeing that again, but to me the answer is jet, because if you go back like the whole way, we had a whole year plus of jet. We've had like, whatever it is, 6 months of chamber, but we had a long time of jet. And thankfully it came to an end, and hopefully we'll see an end to chamber as well. But don't let the current moment cloud your judgment. It is jet.
That was a pretty good spiel. I have a very hard time disputing anything other than that. I do think that you brought up two agents that I did have in mind when I was writing this question, aside from Chamber and Jet. It's kind of a bait question, because I know everybody's complaining about Chamber. It's definitely not Chamber. As good as Chamber is, it's definitely not Chamber. My two thoughts were Sova and Astra. And the reason for that is Sova has sort of defined what it means to be a support player in the game. He gives you wall hack. He's the only agent. He's the only thing in all of competitive shooting before, Fade, and I guess there's probably some Rainbow Six agents or whatever that give wall hack. But Sova giving wall hack in a tactical shooter was pretty bananas. And the drone, back when it had like twice as much health, twice as much range, the fact that you could single-handedly clear an entire site for your team. Like, you couldn't play a map without Sova, right? He's the definition of a support agent, and also the definition of like the cornerstone of a comp. And then my other sort of take for Astra is that this agent quite literally changed the meta single-handedly. We went from this, triple duelist, super aggressive style of Valorant to just molasses Valorant. The fight for Astra meta was so slow. I mean, I'm just remembering Split. The most miserable experience for viewers and players alike. You gotta just sit there and choke points and just tank utility for a minute and a half and then execute on the bomb site, hopefully. So those are my two takes, but now just thinking back at what Jet did to the game, and not only just in the competitive scene, I quite literally do not think that Valorant would be as popular as it is right now without the presence of Jet. Jet is the highlight agent. It's the reason that people got excited about the game, because you had people like ACU and Tens and every streamer in the world playing Jet, putting up these knife clips. Korean Jet is still a meme because of the right click. I actually think that Jet is in no small part responsible for the success of this game. Because you need something that's marketable, and the skill that players with, that players were able to display with Jet is something that no other agent has allowed them to do. And I think that that's actually been really important to the health of Valorant and its growth over the first couple of years. So I'm going to agree with you on that. Again, we're not really disagreeing too much right here, but it's kind of hard because, you're pretty smart, and I agree with you.
Well, I mean, if we just talk about Jet for a bit longer, obviously, that's, I think, another reason that people hate Chamber even more. Is it because, like, he's like a boring Jet? At least Jet was fun. Like, yeah, sure, she was broken and whatever, but at least it was like, at least you could do cool stuff. At least there was like crazy things that could happen. You could watch a CNED play with Jet and be like, oh my god, what is going on? Whereas Chamber, it's a bit like, oh, he teleported away. Oh,
right.
Fun.
Yeah, I mean, he has these slows built into his kit. It's like, nobody wants to go slow. You want to go fast.
Yeah,
give me more fast plays.
Twice, double flip, and now I'm knifing you in the face. Like, yeah, at least that was fun as well. Well, let's move on.
All right. So now let's move into sort of a similar topic, but for talking about the overall competitive scene. Let's talk about the tournaments that we had. And I want to know what you think was the best tournament of pre-franchise. Which one had the best storylines? Which one had the best Valorant? Which one was the most exciting tournament that you watched?
See, to me, this is like the hardest question. Like the literal hardest question, I think, overall. And I think obviously a lot of people will be clouded. Like, if you support a team that won a tournament, that's probably the tournament that was your favorite because your favorite team won, right? So for a lot of people, like, Sentinels winning the first international tournament, obviously that, had a very high viewership, right, for the first tournament, and everyone's really excited to see, who is actually good at this game, right? And obviously now we look back at that tournament, I think everyone kind of goes, what the hell was going on? Like, what were they doing? What were they thinking? Everyone's playing Reyna. Like, what's going on? Um, and so I think there was a bit kind of like, people look back at that and kind of discredit it somewhat. But I think at the time, and again, for someone who was just getting into Valorant, right? Like that tournament was pretty hype. Because there was that just complete unknown of like how good are the regions, right? No one really knew what was going on. Um, and so I can understand that. And then you've got like the second one, obviously with Gambit winning, and that's kind of like, them playing at like perhaps the highest peak we've seen a team play, and it was like, oh my god. And then Acend winning the first champs. And I do think the first champs as well is probably a contender in a lot of people's eyes. Because it had some great storylines like Crew and whatever, right? It had like the Sentinels team that everyone was still kind of holding on to. That game versus Crew, I think, is one that sticks in people's minds as like one of perhaps the biggest moments in esports Valorant. So and there's definitely some crazy things going on there. We had a best of 5 finals as well with Ascend, right, and Gambit. So I think Champs 2021 has a good case as well. And then moving into 2022, though, I actually think I might move into 2022 because I think a lot of people might be like, yeah, because it's not far enough in the brain yet. Like back in nostalgia days, they might like not care too much, and they might be like, oh, Chamber's boring, yada yada, which is somewhat true. I will give you that as well, but to me, the big thing about this year of Valorant, of course, was that we got the kind of the parity level across all of the different regions. And like, you might not remember it all, but obviously like Zeta's run was super cool to see them like do, no one expected that whatsoever, right? And that was really cool. And then, we got Paper Rex going crazy in Copenhagen, but I also really like this champs. I think that the quality of gameplay at Champs was very good. Obviously, we had our first non-EMEA NA winner as well in Loud, who, were very deserving to win. And I thought we had maybe not as many crazy moments, although there was some crazy moments, but maybe not as many, like, what is going on moments. But for me, as someone who watches, like, every single game, I think I was probably happiest with this tournament in terms of being, like, the highest quality level tournament I think we've had, which obviously makes sense, right, as we go on in time. But I think that, all of the teams showcased something, right? There wasn't, I mean, even teams that perhaps you didn't expect much from, right? Like Fury or whatever, right? They beat Fnatic on Icebox.
Yep.
No one who had that, right? Who could ever predicted that? And it just showed how close everything was. It felt like every game was like you were 1 or 2 rounds away, and it could go completely the opposite way. And I think every team showed something in that tournament. Whereas if you go back and actually look like, oh, you could probably go to like, oh yeah, they didn't really do anything in that tournament. Oh yeah, they didn't even do anything in that tournament. Whereas if you even look at the teams that went out straight away, there was some really like interesting things going on. Xerxia playing Yoru and Phoenix and whatever, and it's wild and wacky and whatever. You got EDG who went out straight away and like they take a map off Paper Rex and it looked like they were going to eliminate Paper Rex for a brief moment. So I think you can go back even to the teams that went out straight away in Champs 2022 and be like, oh, they actually were all pretty good. This level, the whole tournament was a good level overall, and so I'm going to pick that. But it is very close, and I could pretty much see an argument for probably any tournament, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just like, as you're speaking, I'm just remembering, because I'm a huge sucker for these like underdog storylines. That's like one of my favorite parts of esports and sports in general, is watching these teams that nobody believes in just prove people wrong over and over and over. And I'm like, the one that sticks out to me, of course, is the Zeta Division one. That whole, just like, it was like emotional to watch, because
yeah, it was
like, this is a region that everybody was memeing on. Like, they hadn't really done anything. They looked like by far the worst region in the entire game, in a game where the parity was pretty good, but then you had Japan, and it was just like not even close. And you're like, oh god, they've got crazy viewership, but they have no results. Are they going to continue to have this crazy viewership? Are we going to lose Japan eventually because nobody wants to play the game? And then we had this run from Zeta Division, and I was like, oh my god, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. But then I also remember the Crew beating Sentinels, back, was that Champs 2021?
That was Champs,
yeah. And their run was insane, and just like how incredible that was. And there was even, I think, like Crazy Raccoon had like a crazy game against Gambit at that tournament, or maybe that was a tournament before, and I was like, what is happening? But for but for me, I think the best underdog storyline that I have seen, and it's kind of weird to call it an underdog storyline, but I have to, is FPX's run at Copenhagen, because I mean, they went through the group stage with a stand-in. They did not have their full team, and you're like, "There's no. This is the team that is
Yeah,
supposed to be
shouldn't
the
be
best
possible.
team. There's no way that they should be able to go out of groups first of all, and then they get in. Sugetsu comes in and just immediately becomes like one of the best players of the tournament. And you're like, how is somebody capable of dealing with all the stress of like getting to this event and then suddenly instantly being thrown into a match with no prep and being like the best player in the server? That particular run by FPX, it just had everything for me because it had like the initial sort of adversarial storyline of the stand-in, and then there were crazy upsets happening all around this. We had like Guild popping off. Like, who is this team? Why are they beating these teams? We had Leviathan all of a sudden showing up. We
Oh
had
my god, yeah.
Paper Rex looking like the most dominant team in the entire game for a while with their Yoru bind comp. I was like, it had
Copenhagen
everything
was
for me.
pretty good, to be fair. Now that you're saying all these things, like, I mean, the exit, like, Leviathan, like, drop the spike in heaven moment.
Oh my god,
the
yeah.
Leviathan fanatic, like, Enzo sticking the spike moment. That was some crazy, crazy games. And then the final as well, you know,
Yeah.
went to map 5. Yeah, Copenhagen was pretty sick.
Yeah, for me, I think it's Copenhagen, but it is so close because, like you said, it could be the first champs, it could be the second champs, it could be like most of the lands I think that we've had.
Yeah.
And for me, that just makes me really happy because it just shows that this game is like it's going to deliver storylines at every tournament pretty much. I don't think we've really had anyone. I mean, I guess you could call maybe like a 3-0 at Reykjavik, the finals being a 3-0, a little disappointing because you kind of wanted Loud to like punch back a little bit more, but at the same time, it was still a really good series, and it was just kind of like Optic playing the best Valorant they played probably in the entire year. So I don't know. I'm just excited about what you know post partnership has in store for us based on how good the international tournaments have been pre partnership. Okay, the ultimate question for pre partnership, pre franchising, the one that we potentially got sorely wrong in our first episode. Which region plays the best Valorant? Which region is the strongest from the pre-franchising, pre-partnership era?
We've taken some time on some of these questions, but this one we can wrap up pretty quick because there is no debate on this one. EMEA was the strongest region pre-franchising.
Oh, come on,
and I won't hear an argument for anything else. Who had they had the most tournament wins, right? Yeah. They got the most tournament wins, I think. Off the top of my head, I'm like trying to do. We got Copenhagen, Champs 1, Masters 3. Yeah, NA's only got 2, right? Thank God Loud won Champs. But yeah, it's EMEA. 3-2. 3-2-1 to EMEA, NA, and Brazil. There you go. That's game over. Let's move on.
I'm going to give my argument for North America just briefly. Don't give me that look, TOB. All right, North America, they had Sentinels. They were the first winners. They had Optic, the most consistent team of the entire last year. The end.
Yeah, they had one team.
Oh, and also, they were the most clouded region, and they were responsible for the most growth in Valorant in the first 2 years.
Okay, just because NA is bad at other games, and Valorant is the one that they have to latch onto. Yeah, I guess.
All right, I think it's probably EMEA. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. Okay, let's talk briefly about post-franchising before we wrap this episode up. Because we just talked about the best region for pre-partnership. So it's kind of hard to say with all the roster moves that are happening right now. But what is your prediction for the best region post-franchising?
This to me is actually...
And there's only 3 right now. We're going down from 6 to 3. So it's a little bit more of like a homogenized system.
This to me is actually quite difficult because a part of me wants to just like, you know, believe EMEA will still be the strongest region. But obviously EMEA doesn't have the same, like, I don't know what you call it, like contraction that the other regions do. Obviously, like you say, all the other regions are kind of, you know, being smacked together into, you know, the Americas League and the Pacific League. So you would assume that, you know, that will increase the overall level of, you know, at least the tier 1 scenes in those places. But actually looking at kind of, you know, some of the roster decisions or lack of roster moves, perhaps in certain places. I'm still very undecided about this, to be honest. Like, there's potential for, I think, a lot of different things to go on, right? Because when you talk about how strong is a region, it's possible that someone in those regions could just form a super team, right? And if you just have a super team and, you just like get the best 5 players across your whole like international league, and then you go on to win international tournaments, everyone might say, oh, well, that's the best region because it has the best team. But that obviously doesn't make you the best region. It makes you have one good team. And so to me, it's kind of a bit question. Like, I think actually it's going to be very, very close because I would have said, like, at this moment in time, EMEA has, like, quite a deep pool of good players. There's a lot of, like, good EMEA free agent players. But because EMEA doesn't have that same, contracting that some of the others do, I actually am not sure that there is a good answer for this. I'm just gonna say EMEA because I'd be betraying myself
Oh boy.
if I didn't.
All right. Well, you're gonna hate my take then.
Go on.
I think that
Is it
EMEA
EMEA?
is going to be the worst of the 3 regions.
Ooh,
And here's my reason for that.
go for it.
First of all, I think that the contracting of all the talent to these,
Mhm.
10 teams in each region is going to be really impactful, but not for EMEA because almost nothing changes for them, right? You've got in Pacific, you have all of the Korean, all the Japanese, all the Filipino, all the Indonesian. Like, you've got tons of talent being concentrated, tons of different styles, tons of different ideas being put together, which is going to create a crazy sort of like melting pot of Valorant. And it's all going to be crazy and it's all going to be aggressive. And then you're going to have DRX trying to stand strong against the tide of just, rage zombies from Day After Tomorrow, whatever that movie is called. Just charging towards them as they try to like hold their setups and play their post plants. And Paper X is coming in with 6 duelists. I don't even know how you have 6 duelists, but there's going to be 6 duelists on one of these specific teams for sure. But then we also have the same kind of thing in North America. And I think in North America, it's potentially even more interesting than the Pacific one, because the Pacific already had sort of like the big like conglomerate tournament to qualify. We had a lot of these teams playing interregionally against each other in like the LCQ. In North America, we haven't really had the contracting of like the LATAM and the North American teams yet. And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch because not only is, Brazil proving itself to be potentially the strongest region. I don't know. They won champions. Can we argue that, they don't have some say in that? And then we also have the likes of Crew. We've seen that Latin America, Brazil, they have coaching staff that's taking stuff very, very seriously. I think they've actually potentially shown to have maybe the best coaches in the game. I don't know. It's kind of hard to say, but Bazooka, incredible work with Loud. Owner, incredible work with Leviathan and Crew. That is, for me, one of the most important things going into this partnership system is the ability to scout and develop talent. And for me, Latin America has done some of the best work in that regard. And their work ethic is clearly very, very high. And North America has always had a little bit of questionable work ethic. And so we could come into a situation where the North American teams are just getting absolutely plowed by the Latin American teams, and it makes them work harder.
Glorious.
It,
That would be so glorious.
it very well could happen. And that will raise their level of play because, these North American teams that are spending, several $1 million a year on a roster are not going to be happy with bad results. So they're going to elevate their game. And I think that honestly, the Americas region, and I don't say this as a North American person that's biased because honestly, I prefer both how EMEA and Pacific plays the game. I will be honest when I say that. I think North America is probably my least favorite region to watch as far as like the actual Valorant goes. But I do think that the Americas region has the most potential because they're bringing in Latin America and Brazil players. And that is going to challenge and elevate the North American players. And it's going to be one of those things where you have the way that NA sees the game and the way that South America sees the game as being fairly different, and it's going to create this cross-pollination that you've seen in Pacific that has led to other things. and that is going to be severely lacking in EMEA. I don't think that EMEA is going to be able to change as rapidly as the other two regions because they just don't have anybody bringing in new ideas. They already all play each other. And for me, in a game that changes as much as Valorant, that's going to be super important and interesting to watch.
That's fair. That's a good argument. I definitely appreciate the part where you mentioned the NA getting destroyed by the LATAM teams. That would be a great thing to
Fingers
watch.
crossed,
That would
right?
be insane to watch. Just watching C9 with Ye just getting destroyed by these 17-year-old LATAM players that no one's ever heard of. I mean, that would be great.
Absolutely. Okay, couple more questions before we end this episode. I'm actually really curious about this because we have never seen a team repeat. We already talked about that before. Is this the year, 2023, the year that we're going to see the first dynasty? Will we see an era team? Will we see the team that actually wins multiple events, that sort of takes over the game and becomes like the ultimate foil to everybody else in the Valorant scene?
This to me is very interesting because often when you get like a dynasty team in anything, it's often because they've, got either a play style or they've figured something out about what's the game that others haven't yet, right? And they just have that edge. And it's kind of interesting that we normally when you get dynasties, it actually happens towards the start of a game, right? Because like there's things to figure out that people might not have other figured out yet, and you just abuse that and take advantage of it, and then eventually everyone catches up. But actually, Valorant's been quite the opposite. I mean, I guess if you go like pre-international tournaments, you could say that there were some teams that were kind of dominant for a while, but ever since the international tournaments have come in, we already haven't seen that. And as we've said, like everything, all of the other regions now, outside of EMEA and NA, are now like up at the same level. So I think it's less likely than it was before to see a dynasty, personally, unless someone creates just a mega team, right? Unless someone just signs like the 5 best players in that region and just goes crazy with it and just says these are the 5 best players and we are just going to win everything and all of those players perform really well. Unless that happens, which I think is unlikely the way it's looking. Yeah, I think it's probably less likely than ever that we see a dynasty. Now, could a team win 2 tournaments in a row? Yeah, maybe, right? Optic could have won their second tournament at Champs, right? FBX might have even, they came 4th, right? It's not like they were miles away. It's not like teams haven't come close to repeating something, or so it could happen. Yeah. But I think like in terms of like a dynasty where a team is just like, going unbeaten, every single tournament winner this year lost games in the tournaments that they won, right? So even the teams that won weren't dominating in those tournaments. So, I think it's unlikely that we get a dynasty, but maybe, pure chance, maybe someone wins that 2 tournaments in a row or something. But I wouldn't, call that crazy dynasty. I mean, maybe Loud win in Sao Paulo if they just keep all their players. Does that count? Because I guess they're kind of the favorites going in. They're on home turf.
I have some bad
maybe
news
they
about
can do that. Oh, well, okay.
I mean, you've seen the rumors probably.
I've seen the rumors, but we will see.
But it does raise an interesting point, is that it's very hard to hold on to a dynastic team of players because everybody wants to buy them out, and then you as the team have to match all those individual salary offers for individual players. It becomes almost impossible to do. So I just want to ask you a follow-up question because I tend to agree. Do you think the game needs a dynastic team, a dynasty team? Is that good for the competitive scene to have one?
I think it adds storylines to things. It adds kind of a different flavor. Like I say, as the year 2021 was kind of 2022, sorry, was kind of the year of parity in region terms. So it would add a storyline. I think it's always good to have a villain. I think Sentinels were very much the kind of villain of the piece for a while, when they were good. And I think that loss to Crew was kind of, like that is why it sticks in people's heads so much, that game, is because that was the moment that the villain got beat by like this big underdog. It was that crazy story around that game and how tense it was and how crazy. And I'm sure so many people were rooting so hard for Crew and some people were rooting so hard for Sentinels. That's kind of what a dynasty adds, I think. So I do think it would be good in terms of like more of a casual fans, experience, because they'll know, oh, this is the team that everyone, doesn't like, or this is the team that I've latched onto, right? Like, so I think It probably would be good maybe from like a viewership point, right? Just to see like people love seeing things like are they gonna is this the time that they lose, right? Is
Right.
this the game that they lose? So it probably would be good in that sense, but I like seeing different teams rise up. As someone who's really into the theme, to me it's more interesting like not knowing what is gonna go on whatsoever, right? Like literally having no idea. That's kind of more interesting to me, but to perhaps more casual people, I think having a dynasty and having like clear like this is the favorite is perhaps a bit easier for people to get into.
Cool. Yeah, I tend to agree. I think every sport needs like a Los Angeles Lakers or
Mm.
what is the equivalent in like the Premier League? I don't really follow professional soccer that
Well,
much.
now it would be Man City,
Okay.
but it would have been Manchester United before. But
Okay.
now it's probably City,
Yeah, yeah. I just
as
feel
they
like that
say.
adds a little bit of extra. Like everybody in baseball hates the Yankees, everybody hates the Lakers, everybody hates the New England Patriots in American hand egg football. Okay, final question of the podcast for you, and this is we got to give a little bone to the players that are losing their jobs here. Which region is going to have the best tier 2 scene?
This is very interesting, and I think there's two different ways to look at this overall. In terms of orgs and in terms of players. In terms of orgs, I feel like the most stability is in EMEA. Because you've got obviously like in NA and maybe the Asia, bigger Asia region as well. There's kind of teams dropping their players, dropping out of Valorant. We haven't heard too much of that from EMEA teams in general. Like a lot of the orgs are just kind of sticking around, maybe because they feel more confident having been in kind of an already existing like VLR structure this
That's
year. They
true.
feel more confident overall with how the system's going to run, and they feel like, okay, yeah, this can work. But obviously in the other regions, we've seen like, orgs drop and whatever. And so from like an org standpoint, I think it's better for EMEA. They have more structure there. They'll be like, perhaps early on it'll be better. But in terms of like player talent, obviously in those other regions where orgs might be dropping out, that means that you have potential for tier 2 teams that are sticking around to sign some unbelievable teams,
Right.
like some unbelievably good like players to that team. So it's kind of a bit of a balance in terms of what you think is more important, whether it's stability or whether it's just pure player power. Because like you look at some of the players that are around in like North America, for instance, who probably it looks like might not get onto a tier 1 team. And like these are some really good players that most people would have been like, oh, they're definitely going to get on a team like 6 months ago they would have thought. Uh, so yeah, I think in terms of the actual players, you might say something more like, the NA scene might be a bit better because there's only 5 NA teams, but a lot of good players. But in terms of like stability and like people knowing how it's going to work and feeling confident perhaps about the structure of the scene overall, I feel like EMEA has a leg up there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's kind of a trick question because I do really think it is sort of a multifaceted thing. And I would agree that EMEA probably seems like the most structured region and will come into next year as likely the most stable because of this VRL history, because of I feel like EMEA just kind of takes esports a little bit more seriously in terms of how they structure their teams in general. Whereas North America, you just have like these cracked players like forming teams for 3 weeks, being like, I hate my
Yeah.
teammate, jumping to another team. And they've got maybe more talent, maybe, but it's not as easy to stick together. In my opinion, I think EMEA is the best to start this year. I think North America will be the best by the end of the year. And then I think in 2 years, Pacific will be the best because I think they have the most players to pull from overall. Because remember, we have a Indian partnered team now. The
Yeah.
game is going to explode in India. The next agent is going to be Indian. There's a billion people in this country. Not all of them are going to be Valorant players, but there's a huge population there. What's happening with China? Are they part of Pacific? Are they going to be their own region in a couple of years? I don't really know. Again, another billion plus people to pull from. Then you have Korea, Valorant #3 in the PC bong scene now. It's rising up the ranks. And Korea has historically taking over games. You know, we've had it in StarCraft, we've had it in League of Legends, we had it in Overwatch. Is Valorant the next victim of the Korean overlords?
And it's hosted in Seoul as well.
It is hosted in Seoul. Well. That is always a possibility. And the greater sort of SEA, Southeast Asia region, has been probably the fastest growing esports region. I've seen it in basically every game at this point, where you just have unbelievable talent coming out of the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand and all these other smaller countries that just create sort of these powerhouse teams, whether it's just, you know, like a country, almost like a World Cup style situation where they just have, you know, the best Indonesian team against the best Thai team. That creates some very interesting dynamics, and they come up with some crazy ideas. I think that the Pacific region, probably in 2 years, maybe a little bit longer, we'll see, but I think they are going to be the ultimate powerhouse in this game in the future. But we'll see, and that's the fun part.
Yeah.
All right, any closing thoughts, TMV? Anything you want to say to everybody that's still listening out there?
No.
Fair enough. Well, thank you once again for watching Cosmic Divide episode 2. Thank you again to Nifter for building us this wonderful studio that we are broadcasting from. Thank you to Acend for letting us spout nonsense on their YouTube channel.
Talk. Endlessly talk.
We will see you next time in episode 3. Thanks for watching.